good to go. So I'll make it to live. All right, so now it's live on YouTube. Okay, let me start with this opening song. All right. So this is Consciousness Talks for 2022, and this year's series will start with the session on the consciousness and the pain. And two speakers for today is Professor Colin Klein, philosopher, and also working on various topics, but also in a pain and the pain structure, conscious pain, and so on. And the second speaker is Stuart Derbyshire from Singapore, who is how should I call you, like a neurologist or neuroscientist?
A neuroscientist will do.
Yeah, on the pain, and we'll discuss about the pain and consciousness. Okay, without much further ado, please, Colin, could you share the slide?
Sure. Okay. All right, shall I just get started?
Yes, please. And we will
right.
stop after 30 minutes or so to take a break. But before that, after the Colin's presentation, during the presentation, we can ask questions, both in YouTube as well as Zoom here.
Okay, super. Well, thanks now. Thanks for everyone for coming out. I've managed to make it to one or two other of these, and it's a really exciting, like, one of the few Zoom things I think that's working well over the past few years. So I wanted to talk about some stuff that I've done. Some of this is in the past, but then also some current work that I'm still thinking about pain as the consciousness of a bodily command. So a very quick thing. So here's a picture. It's kind of gruesome one. This is actually my wife dislocated her finger playing Aussie rules football. It hurt a lot. And one thing you might ask, particularly if you're a philosopher, is, okay, there's pain there, but what's the content of that pain? What's that pain saying? And that may, if you're not coming from a certain tradition in philosophy, that may strike you as slightly odd. So just to kind of situate myself as where I'm working, I'm broadly speaking working what's called an intentionalist theory of consciousness. So an intentionalist theory says, look, we have certain states, often thought of as representational states, and we're conscious because we have states that are about something. So if I'm thinking about an apple, I have a state that's about an apple, and I'm conscious of the intentional object of that state. So I'm not conscious of the representation itself, only what it represents. Now, I'm not going to defend intentionalism here. The idea is that, well, you've got you've got one mystery, which is consciousness. You reduce it to another, hopefully easier mystery, that of intentional content. Lots of people think, that's compatible with being some kind of naturalist about the world. And it also explains why, consciousness seems like a hard problem, because the reason why we're conscious, namely because we have these intentional states, we're not actually conscious of that, just of the intentional object. That's all by way of background, but it's still, most of the discussion of intentionalism is about things like being aware of apples, visual sensations. You might think, well, what about pains? And broadly speaking, in the literature, there are two kinds of views about what the pain from this finger says. So the first one, and by far the most common up until about maybe 20 years ago, what we call representational theory. So the idea is, look, pain has a content, and the content says something like, there's some damage, your finger's messed up. This, or, sometimes that content might have some evaluative content. So this state is bad. Now, each of these, just to make a distinction, each of these were kind of, in English, we use indicative sentences, and those express propositions, so ways the world is, and propositions have truth conditions. So, you could have a pain that says damage here, but if you've got a phantom limb, there's no actual place for there to be damage, so that what we say about that pain is that it's, it's saying something false about the world. Now, The other possibility, and the kind of ones that come from literature, is what we call imperative theory. So rather than things like damage here, what we have are sentences, like the model sentence is going to be things like stop. So, stop doing that, or make this go away. So we got some state, and what it says is, this shouldn't be there, make it go away. And in English, we express these as sentences in the imperative mode, and they express commands, and commands have satisfaction conditions rather than truth conditions. So if I say close the door, that kind of sentence can't be true or false, although it might be satisfied, it might be unsatisfiable, it might not make sense. So we talk in terms of satisfaction. Now, I've sort of given example sentences in English, but the idea is we can equally well talk about brain states that, for example, have the same relationship to propositions and so have truth conditions, or have commands with satisfaction conditions. So this is a book now starting to get old. So this is a book of mine from 2015, defending a pure imperativist theory of pain. So this is saying that pain only has an imperative, and the command is roughly something like protect B from E with priority B. So protect this part of your body from a certain kind of action with a certain kind of priority. And that gives you the kind of location and quality and intensity of pain. So that's the representation. Through transparency, you're only you're kind of conscious of something else. But that's the kind of basic thing that pain says. And you might think, well, why? Why care about imperatives? I think there are a few reasons. So one thing I've always been struck by, and this motivates a lot of the count, is pains are actually quite uninformative. So I have a pain kind of midway down my left lat, and I don't know why, right? I might have pulled it when I worked out this morning. It might be from being hunched over. It might just be a cramp. Might be some horrible cancer. Who knows? So I don't know in very many cases, I don't know why I'm feeling pain. But on the other hand, I kind of know what I should do about it. Certain ways of sitting don't feel good. Other ways feel better. I know that I shouldn't really overexert it, or it'll probably get worse. So, pains don't seem to work like the indicative sensations, like seeing an apple. That tells me that an apple's there. That informs me about something. But pain just kind of tells me what to do. It doesn't inform me of anything. It also seems like, if I see an apple, what I do about it might depend on what I want, what I care about. Sometimes I do one thing, sometimes I do another thing. Whereas pains always seem to have this very direct connection to motivation. There's certain weird cases around this, and a lot of the book is actually thinking about some of these. But in general, feeling a physical pain seems to motivate you to do something. And that's a reason to think that the content of a pain is something more like a command to do something. And then finally, and one thing I've been emphasizing more over the years is I like this because it gives a unified treatment of pain as one of a large class of what we call homeostatic sensations, each of which has an imperative treatment. So pain is a bit like, I should say, any of these, right? Homeostatic sensations, what they all have in common is they command some kind of action that, sort of all things being equal, alleviates an underlying condition that's some threat to some aspect of homeostasis. So just to give some other, there are many of these, but, hunger says eat. And if you eat, it will get rid of the state that's causing you to be hunger. Thirst says drink. Being tired says sleep. Being, central heat rather than tactile heat says, find shade. There's the sensation of needing to pee, and choking, itching. So itches say scratch, and so on and so on. So you've got this class of sensations, all of which seem to have a tight connection to survival, all of which seem to have direct motivational import. And so all of them seem amenable to this kind of imperative treatment. And I think pain ought to be included in that as well. And so the idea, and I should say this, so the idea is pain in your shoulder says, roughly protect your shoulder. And this is an idea that I take from the great pain scientist P.D. Wall. Most of the time when certainly philosophers think about pain, they think about pinpricks or something very acute. But most of the pains we actually feel are either pains of recuperation or pains that help us avoid injury in the first place. So, one of the things that's very important, because we're these kind of meat robots going around the world, is that, we can get broken in ways where if we rest for a while, it will get better. And one of the really important things of pain is to keep you from doing actions that will interfere with recuperation. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about people who never feel pain at all. And they can kind of learn in many cases to avoid acute injury, but it's, healing injuries and the kind of weight of chronic injury that really brings them down. And this is to connect it back to consciousness a bit. So I'll say a bit about consciousness now. One reason I think that we have to be aware of homeostatic sensations, rather than just say having pure pain reflexes, is because we often need to make trade-offs about the different homeostatic demands we have. So, I've got maybe I've got a pain in my ankle. It kind of hurts to walk. All things being equal, I should avoid walking. But of course, I'm going to have to go to the bathroom. I'm going to have to get things to eat. So I've got different demands placed upon me by my homeostatic sensations. And the fact that I have to trade them off is precisely the reason why I need to be conscious of them. This is the theory. So just to connect this up to some other work I've done on consciousness. So this is another paper. This is from 2016 in PNAS with my perpetual collaborator, Andy Barron, in called What Insects Can Tell Us About the Origin of Consciousness. And this paper has a certain notoriety because in it we argue that bees are probably conscious. For anyone who's familiar with the paper, Andy and I were also surprised by this conclusion. We started out assuming that was probably not true, but we're very inspired by Bjorn Merker's work, and so a lot of this is an application of Merker to insects, as well as with some new neuroscientific findings around insects. Now, unlike many theories, including IIT, which I know is well represented here, or various kinds of panpsychism, we actually think there's a line to be drawn. So for example, nematodes aren't conscious. And in general, insects are probably, insects and the family more broadly, are probably the simplest organisms that are still conscious. There's an argument in the paper, again, this is about the structural flow of information more than anything. So a lot of this is about the kinds of information and how it's brought together. I'm part of a Tumtum World Charity Foundation project now that's expanding this out to think about the evolution of consciousness. But one thing I think is particularly important here, so I think there's an argument that you can get, a nematode works a bit like, if people are familiar with Rodney Brooks's old subsumption architecture robots. So subsumption architecture worked really well for very simple robots because it had a fixed priority ordering. But kind of notoriously, it's very hard to extend to more complicated robots because sometimes the priority of different actions depends on the current internal state and so on. So what you get by the time of an insect is that you've got things that can work with variable priority sensations. Sometimes foraging is important, sometimes attacking is important, sometimes nest tending is important. So you've got different things with variable priority. And I think sometimes people ask, well, if bees are conscious, what are they conscious of? I think the most likely, the primary candidate for the first thing they're going to be conscious of is the homeostatic sensations. So these are precisely the ones that are very tightly linked to survival, that evolution would have very, good reason to put in there. And also because those are the whole point of them is to be able to trade off against different homeostatic demands in planning your day. Whereas like representing things in the world, the indicative sensations, that's when you get, once you get to us, we have sensations that have both an indicative and imperative content. But for something as simple as an insect, it may be that you need at least very few of those, so very little of that kind of indicative information. And one thing I'm interested in kind of more generally is just this, there's a big difference between me and a bee. There's a lot of evolution in there. And so in the background, there's a theory, which I can talk about if anyone would like, about how you distinguish indicative and imperative sensations in an information theoretic sense. This is coming from a kind of skirm signaling game in the background. But that model allows for there to be intermediate cases. You might think emotions work somewhat like this. I also think that emotions are the sorts of things that allow you to elaborate. So, I can be afraid of something, and that fear might be a kind of simple, directly motivating thing. But on the other hand, you think of something like sexual desire. I might want somebody who's right there, but I might also want someone who's very far away across the sea. And that's going to involve both a kind of motivational state and a representational one. So I'll represent her and her beauty. And I'll also feel like, I'm not just motivated just to walk across the room, but motivates me to find flights and so on. So you can start imagining sensations that are somewhere in between the homeostatic and indicative sensations. And that might be a way where you kind of, you get something of an evolutionary gradient that builds you up more and more complicated conscious contents. So with that in mind, I just want to say thanks. There's a copy of the book. If anyone buys it, they'll give me literal cents in royalties at this point. But also you can find more information about my work. And also we've got a project webpage for the Major Transitions Project that's talking a lot more about these structural arguments and how they work. So that's what I've got, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. It was very clear presentation, and maybe I can start picking up some question from or comment on the YouTube first. It says it's amazing how much science is really at its core about philosophy and semantics. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I agree, but I'm a philosopher, so it is interesting. I mean, I think of myself as a sort of philosopher of neuroscience at heart, but one thing that is, interesting about this aspect of my work is there's a lot of thinking about what brains might represent, for example. The analogies and the way people think about it, you really are doing something more like going over to resources from philosophy of language or linguistics, just trying to, because that's, where we have complex structured contents. So I do think it's one of the nice things about consciousness. You end up doing this, quite interdisciplinary work just out of necessity, because you get little pieces of the answer everywhere.
I see. Okay, thank you. Ariel?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. That's really interesting. I just wanted to check whether it's the case that we could have exactly the same conversation about other homeostatic sensations with different valences. So like if we were talking about pleasure, could we do exactly the same analysis, but we're just switching the imperative from like act to like good job, do it again, or maintain that? Would it be the same conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's interesting, and I will flag, I'm not sure anyone actually believes my theory other than me. So to flag that, this is the part where it gets slightly complicated. So I think it's possible to have homeostatic sensations that don't hurt. So I actually think it's possible for there to have pains that don't hurt. So I think there's actually a separate quality. I didn't talk about this. You might call painfulness or hurt, and pleasantness or pleasurableness. Now, one way you might think about those is essentially a second order imperative. So pleasure says, whatever that is, do that again. Because one of the things that's quite complicated about, say something like pleasure, I think it's very easy to motivate, is it seems like there are lots and lots of things that are pleasant. So, what did Conan the Barbarian like? To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, to hear the lamentations of their women. All of those are pleasant. It's hard to see what they have in common, but there's a kind of common content, which is to say something like, that's good, more of that. So I think in the book, and I'm still never quite sure about this, I mean, there are different ways to cash out. You could be a first order imperativist, but you could be an evaluativist about, about pleasure. So you might say, look, there are commands, but then what it is to be pleasant is to say that's good, or it could be more of that or something like that. So Luca Barlacina has some stuff on reflexive imperativism. My old collaborator Manolo Martinez has some stuff on this as well. So I think it's an open question. I'm always kind of tempted by that, but that's one where my grounding is less firm, or I'm less sure what to say about it. But yeah, definitely a going idea.
Okay, we have a question from Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. That's a really nice talk. And I think you're already starting to answer this question, but to me, it's a strange theory of pain that doesn't include the content of pain. That a pain that, as you just said, that doesn't hurt would strike most people as really quite peculiar. And I just wonder if you feel like, given how far away from what we consider pain to be when we experience it, if you can hold on to your theory without allowing some content, some what it is like to be pain into it.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, I should probably stop leading answers with the unattractive versions or attractive parts of my theory. But I've convinced myself of this over the years. And the way I normally think about it is, so there are two strands here. One is to say, look, we have other homeostatic sensations like hunger and thirst, especially mild hunger and thirst, aren't necessarily unpleasant. They're still motivating, but they tell me what to do. I actually think if one attends to particularly postural pains often have this quality as well, unless you can't move around and then they become painful. the other thing which motivates a lot of this that I didn't talk about is questions of what to do. So it does seem like there are cases of pains that don't motivate or pains that people don't care about. And it's so my original interest in this, I broke my ankle quite badly when I was 13, and I went to the hospital and they gave me a shot of morphine. And then there was a period where I would describe it as, look, it hurts, but I don't care. It's off down there. I'm up here. I know I shouldn't walk on it, but otherwise, whatever. Like, so I kind of knew what the content was and it motivated me, but I didn't care about it. And from what I can tell, talking to, ER doctors, that's quite common. Dennett talks about this as well, so it's a very old phenomenon. So I do think that you get in the right circumstances, and then there's some more complicated pathological ones, that you can get physical pains that don't hurt. Now, there's also a very good reason why in most cases they ought to hurt. So some of this is, I think, a kind of ambiguity in English. And sometimes we talk about this by talking about, physical pain as opposed to other kinds of pain. Now, you may say more about this because I remember seeing you give a talk on this very long ago, as we figured out. But that's the background intuition, that you can have homeostatic sensations that don't hurt, and that so you can actually start generating cases of pain that don't hurt. But then there's a very good evolutionary reason why most of the time even mild pains ought to hurt.
I mean, just a brief follow-up. So I guess the issue for me is that I quite like that there's an imperative associated with pain. It does make a lot of sense, and as you say, Pat talks about this a lot. But to me, that feels like it's the unconscious part of pain. That the imperative is what's going on in the background. We don't really feel our homeostatic mechanisms so much as that they inform us to do things, as you point out. Yeah. I mean, in some sense, and this is the kind of intentionalist move. So whatever's going on, what we feel is not the, sentence protect yourself or the representation protect yourself, but it's something else. And there's a bit of a mystery there that, there's a bit of a mystery for all intentionalists. There's more to say there. A lot of the book is just kind of assuming intentionalism. But yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting about it is, and this was a bit to the kind of trade-offs part, that most of the time you don't have to feel, there are lots of homeostatic things that don't have an accompanying sensation because they kind of get worked out or they don't. So, although I keep saying things and then I find out that people think there is a sensation, but like blood acidity or something, that just kind of does its thing or it doesn't do its thing. So what's interesting is then there's this other class of sensations where, if I'm in pain or if I'm in hunger, I've got to kind of do more planning to figure out how to deal with it. I can't just, there are obviously pain reflexes, but beyond that, thinking about pains of recuperation, then I do have to be aware of what it's telling me precisely so I can figure out the best way to satisfy the different demands on me.
Okay, we have a question again from YouTube, but before going that, I also have my own question.
Sure.
And about the last slide that you talked about C. elegans and also bees.
Yeah, put it back up. Here's some bees.
Yeah, so the boundary of conscious and non-conscious is to some extent your subjective kind of impression of what it should be like, right, to some extent, but that's not my issue. Whether the kind of the criterion that you're proposing here, would it be also applicable when you want to talk about artificial consciousness and so on?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so we've got on the more current work, what we think is you've got what we call major transition, drawing on the major transitions literature and philosophy of biology, between something like a nematode, which has a centralized but largely feed-forward neural network, from something like a bee, where you've got a serious recurrent set of central connections. So and then there's more story to be said there. But that said, I think, once you start going to artificial consciousness, so I mean, there are two things to say, one pro, one con. The pro one is all of this is meant to be formulated at a level of abstraction where it doesn't require neurons, so it could well be something artificial. On the other hand, and this is one thing that distinguishes it from, say, IIT or a global workspace theory, it's also important the kinds of information that are coming in. So they have to be kinds of information about homeostatic demands, about the body, about self-movement, and so on. So one thing I would like to be true, but I don't have an argument for it, is I have much easier time accepting artificial consciousness in robots, again, because I think we're basically a certain kind of robot. Whereas in completely disembodied computational systems, then it seems a bit harder. And a natural way to cash that out is to say, look, you need both a certain kind of informational structure and also a certain kind of information flowing through it. But there's no, in principle, reason. We're quite happy. And actually part of the Major Transitions project, this is the bit that's hosted at Cambridge, is actually doing a lot of stuff with, and we've got some collaborators in Sheffield as well. So doing a lot of stuff with simulations and trying to figure out, how much of this can be simulated? What does that simulation tell us? Are we going to accidentally make conscious computers? I guess that'd be good for the grant.
I see. So that in a sense that you think that in some kind of the embodiment would be probably necessary to realize this kind of a prioritization of especially the homeostatic sensations, and that may be the one that would be completely missing in this disembodied highly intelligent AI system, which may or may not correspond to the presence of absence of consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, one thing though, just another curlicue on this, and the thing that I've been writing stuff about more recently, and I'm still quite excited about, there's a bias in a lot of thinking about consciousness and philosophy of mind in general to sort of task-bound, like kind of input-output sorts of things. So, the bee sees a flower and flies towards it. Whereas I feel like a lot of what goes on in brains, and one of the important things of brains, is not, this variable priority thing is the tip of the iceberg. So there's a whole set of processes that's kind of adjudicating between different demands, but then also adjudicating between different computational processes, for example. And so it's a kind of resource allocation problem. And I actually think that's a really interesting feature of brains that still gets less airtime than it should. And I think it's also something that's worth thinking about with computers as well. Because the sense in which computers do a lot, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background of your computer. Most of what the operating system does is kind of decide who gets to use the processor and who gets to use the memory and so on. So I think it's an interesting and still underexplored way of thinking about what the important thing that's going on in brains is. So I think that's also another interesting place where you might be able to connect up the computational and the neural.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then maybe by answering this, the last question from YouTube, maybe we can take a break, 4-minute break, and then to go to Stuart. The last one is lobotomy patients often continue to feel pain at the same intensities, but didn't care about it. So if you, maybe this is just a comment.
Yeah, so this is great. I mean, and I discussed some of this in the book along with a possibly related syndrome called pain asymbolia, which have very rare consequence of insular damage. And I think these are the sorts of cases where, and there are two things to say. One is what I said to Stuart before, and that's the more interesting one, which is you can have a disruption of whether you care about it. The real question is whether that also disrupts a more general sense of caring about yourself. So one of the interesting things about pain asymbolia is those patients, it's not just that they report feeling pain and are indifferent to it, but they also seem indifferent to various other kinds of physical threats and so on. So it seems like there's a more profound sense of loss there. The other thing which is hard to disentangle, and I should mention this is a hard thing with any theorizing about pain, is lobotomy patients often have a kind of flattened affect anyway, and a lot of what we think of as our response to pain is really like secondary affect evoked by pain. So like, I had a pain in my tooth, and then I went to the dentist and he said, oh, you're going to need a root canal. And then I paid a lot more attention to it, and I was really anxious about it, and I was really nervous about it, and like sad, and maybe it felt worse, and I'm not sure. But whatever's changed there, it's probably has relatively little to do with the tooth, and a lot to do with my emotions and thoughts around it. And clearly one of the things that lobotomy patients lose is some of that secondary affect as well. So lobotomy patients are a bit of a messy case. Similarly, morphine pain, which I motivate this, I mean, I always point out in talks like, you know, there was the morphine, it was philosophically interesting, but I was also super high because they gave me a bunch of morphine. So it's like very hard to distinguish a lot of the components of the experience. But I think this is just a general like kind of issue with a lot of pain sciences. Pain is such a complicated emotion, and you can lop off bits of it with different interventions. But it's very hard, you know, in some sense, to get down to what the core of it really is. There's definitely, you know, some of that is definitely the interesting thing going on with lobotomy patients.
All right. So with that, we'll take a 4-minute break here, and
Okay, super.
during
Great.
this time,
Thank you all very much.
Yep. You can take a break, and for those who had some thoughts, you can leave the comments on the chat or either Zoom chat or YouTube chat function. Okay. So Now let's move on to second speaker. Please, Stuart, share the
Okay.
screen.
Thanks very much. Okay, I assume you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to catch up with Colin. It's been over a decade since we last spoke to each other back in Chicago. And I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, mainly on the difficulties of using neuroscience to decide if something can feel pain. So if you've ever casually thought about pain, then probably the model that's shown here and first proposed by Descartes in 1600s is likely the kind of model that you will have come up with. So pain is that thing that you experience when a particular stimulus, such as a needle, damages or threatens to damage your tissue. This is known as specificity theory because it predicts that pain and the noxious stimulus will have a specific relationship. Indeed, from this model, you can define pain as the response to noxious stimuli. But that raises a question, which has been around for a long time, which is how does the physical activity of the body in response to the noxious stimulus give rise to, connect with, or translate into the subjective part of what we are? And Descartes' answer to this is notorious. The senses only receive impacts from surrounding matter. It's the rational soul that represents things, including colors, textures, temperatures, and pain. Or more succinctly, God does that bit. It's fair to say that we're not fond of that particular argument anymore. Descartes also notoriously denied pain to animals because they lacked a soul and were not rational or reasonable. And I think it's probably fair to say that we're not fond of that argument either. We prefer to rule pain in or out on more material grounds. So I'm going to consider the humble fruit fly Drosophila or maggot. The Drosophila will bend and roll away from a noxious heat source, which indicates a system of sensory detection connected to motor circuitry. Now, before Colin's talk, I thought I was on solid ground here, but maybe not. I think most of us will agree that that's a clever trick, but we would also agree that it's not demonstrating that Drosophila feels pain. The minimal neural net inside the Drosophila is a long way from the complex human neurocircuitry that we believe supports our experience of pain. And that's part of the reason, at least, why we broadly reject the Drosophila as a creature able to experience pain. It has a neural inadequacy that rules it out. So work from a lot of groups beginning in the early 90s have demonstrated that pain in humans is supported by a cascade of neural activity, typically beginning with activation of peripheral neurons by a noxious stimulus, which activates spinal neurons, which activates various thalamic nuclei, including the VPL, the MDVC, and the VMPO. And then those nuclei activate different cortical regions, including the primary, the secondary, sensory cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and the insula. And broadly speaking, for the longest time, this was considered the neural network, the connectome, the neuromatrix, call it what you will, that was necessary for pain. And that neural complexity underlying pain experience complemented the broadly accepted ISP definition of pain, which was revised in 2020 and now states that pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with or resembling that associated with actual or potential tissue damage. I don't actually think that this is a huge modification from the original 1979 definition. A note to the 1979 definition stated that pain is always a subjective experience. That was revised in 2020 to state that pain is always a personal experience. Again, I don't see that as a huge change. Not enough, certainly, I don't think, to dissolve the happy marriage of the ISP definition of pain with the neuromatrix. So the different cortical structures that were demonstrated to activate in response to noxious stimuli are now associated with the different components of pain. So the primary and secondary somatosensory cortex generates the sensory components, the anterior cingulate cortex, the emotional components, the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive component, and maybe some of the secondary affect. And so it seemed like we'd made good progress from Descartes' model. Modern neuroscience provided a way out of God does it via a more materialist answer, which is the brain does it. We stripped out the divine intervention to explain subjectivity and replaced it with the neuromatrix generating the various components of pain experience that make up the subjectivity of pain. And in that way, we sort of jammed the subjective experience of pain and the cortex together to produce a materialist solution to pain subjectivity. And that understanding was used to make a pretty hefty claim about the fetus and its inability to feel pain. So this is a report that I was involved in putting together on fetal awareness in 2010. The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists put together a panel to discuss the possibility of fetal pain. And this is the central conclusion that we came to. In reviewing the neuroanatomical and physiological evidence in the fetus, it was apparent that connections from the periphery to the cortex are not intact before 24 weeks of gestation. And as most neuroscientists believe that the cortex is necessary for pain perception, it can be concluded that the fetus cannot experience pain in any sense prior to this gestation. So I don't think jamming the neuromatrix and the definition of pain together to resolve the mind-body problem works anymore. And that's in part because of two studies that have dissociated the cortex from pain experience. So the first is a study showing activation of the pain neuromatrix during noxious stimulation in patients that are congenitally unable to experience pain. So they were born without the necessary peptides, that's not the right word, whatever, the necessary genes for their nociceptors to work, so they don't feel pain. And in this study, they were delivered a noxious stimulus and activated the pain neuromatrix. So this study doesn't show that pain won't activate the pain neuromatrix, that's still possible, but it does show that activation of the pain neuromatrix doesn't have to generate pain. And then there was a second study from the same group, which demonstrates pain experience in a patient with widespread damage to the neuromatrix. So this study doesn't show that activation of the pain neuromatrix won't generate pain, but it does show that pain experience doesn't rely on activation of the pain neuromatrix. So we have a study of patients without the ability to feel pain generating pain matrix activity in response to a noxious stimulus, and a patient mostly without the pain matrix still reporting pain. So these two studies, I think, largely dissociate pain from the cortex, at least enough for me to reconsider the necessity of the cortex for pain experience. But the issue is that surely the International Association for the Study of Pain definition makes such a conclusion impossible. If pain is multidimensional and subjective, conscious, how can it not rely on cortical activity? So Colin gives us one possible answer to that. Maybe we don't need all those components for pain. Pain doesn't have to include sensation, affect, and cognition, or whatever else we might bung in there. We can reduce the essence of pain to an imperative of pain, as we've been discussing. And others have also suggested a similar reduction in the complexity of pain without a corresponding reduction in the in the underlying complexity of the neurobiology as well. And these new findings and the swirling debate about what pain is led myself and John Bachman to reconsider fetal pain a couple of years ago. So the first thing we agreed is that we've got to escape the enormity of the ISP definition. And we did that in the following way. We wrote, as others have pointed out, such a demanding definition of pain restricts pain almost exclusively to fairly mature human beings. To ease that restriction, it might be worthwhile to consider a less sophisticated definition, which focuses less on subjective reflection, knowing that I am in pain, and more on the immediate raw phenomenological feel of pain, being in pain. So maybe this allows us to reconsider pain in different things and creatures, creating a sort of taxonomy of pain, if you like. So let's consider sausages, Drosophila, dogs, and humans. So the sausage will bend when heated on a grill, but there is no biological activity. The sausage bends when heated because of its physical properties. And so most of us would say for sure there's no pain unless we start entertaining some really wacky ideas about panpsychism. The Drosophila has a reflex response, that means the larvae bends and rolls away, which we can call pain if we define pain as a reflexive defense, or if we engage in some lighter version of those wacky ideas. The dog has a more flexible sensory motor integration with cognitive control involving the brainstem or a version of the neuromatrix. And we can call that pain without making it the equivalent of what a human experiences or reducing the experience to what the Drosophila experiences. And then finally, we have the human, the metaflexible sensory motor integration requiring the neuromatrix, or what is more fashionably being called the connectome today. This is a pain that is self-reflective, a state of knowing that beyond the state of being that. So I think we can define pain in humans as a multidimensional, conscious, reflective experience that extends beyond what other creatures do feel. In doing that, perhaps we can reassert the importance of neural complexity to support pain in humans without having to deny less sophisticated forms of pain in other creatures with less neural complexity. But I still don't think we can dissolve pain into the standalone brain because self-reflective experience, I think, needs development as well as a brain. So I'll illustrate what I mean with a classic experiment. So this is a vision experiment. Here's a picture of two girls dancing with someone in the background playing bagpipes. You can see that effortlessly and immediately, but there is a tremendous amount of detail in that image. I mean, you can break it down into a vast array of subsets of lines, luminescences, hues, and so forth, which is illustrated partly in B. You might think that extracting the outlines in C from B is natural and automatic, but there's good evidence for that not being the case. So when presented with these images, when people born with cataracts that were corrected in adults were presented with these images, they struggled immensely. And they struggled with simpler images too. People born with cataracts, corrected early in adults, were asked what they see in these simple images here, and they reported a wide variety of responses. So in response to this image, for example, the patients reported seeing up to 9 separate objects. They saw the surface appearance perhaps, but not the object. They didn't see the cube. And so through our early years in development, I think we learn to integrate scenes into separate coherent objects. We're not aware that we've learned that, and we take vision for granted when we grow up. Sensory experience without that conceptual organization, without categories, contains nothing beyond the immediate surface appearance. So you can't see beyond the surface appearances. Perhaps that experience just is, and it is because it is. A pure apprehension without comprehension, without meaning, without depth, without extension. And so similarly, I would argue that fetal pain might not extend beyond its surface into fear or dread or into any explicit acknowledgement that I am in pain. That conceptual development emerging in early infancy involves a transition from being that to knowing that. So in closing, I would say that development matters. Before 12 weeks gestation, pain doesn't make any sense. The free nerve endings or nociceptors are probably absent from most areas of the body, and those are necessary for pain from injury. And so there, the neuroscience is definitively helpful. But after 12 weeks, we enter the terrain of a possible raw and unknowable pain experience, something apprehended in an immediacy, but not comprehended in a reflection. Whether pain is experienced after 12 weeks depends more on how we define pain. Later in gestation, there'll be more sophisticated movements, facial expressions, and so forth. If we define pain as a complex behavioral response to injury, then the later gestational fetus feels pain. From birth onwards, those behaviors are explicitly recognized by a caregiver, and the infant can interact with others. Games like peekaboo entertain the infant. The game isn't articulated, it's bodily. But behind it is an abstraction that matters to the infant on an emotional level. The infant continues to shift from bodily action and expression to internal actions, thoughts, reflection, and understanding. Profound changes in psychological being that will matter, I think, to how we feel. There's a movement in mind from the reflexive to the reflective. Feelings now become explicitly known and articulated. And now Nietzsche kicks in, and the real pain of being begins as the infant transitions from being that to knowing that. Okay, and that's all from me. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was also again very clear and inspirational talk. Is there any question? Okay. So first, Colin, please.
Oh, sure. Thanks, sir. I mean, it's lovely talk. I think we actually agree about a lot of things, which is nice to hear. So one thing I wanted to ask you about a bit near the end, because I'm not sure what I think about this myself, and I've heard this come up, for example, I think I originally got it maybe from Lead and Snedden in discussions of fish pain. So there's a natural instinct, which I suppose I had at first too, which is to think, look, there's a sense in which my pain is more elaborated and therefore potentially much worse because there's more stuff that can be packed in there. But you might think, look, without the sort of more complicated and more reflexive aspects of pain, in some sense, it's the mere surface can be much worse as well because it's just pain. It's just bad. There's no ability to think, for example, that it might cease sometime soon. No ability. You don't have any felt control or self-efficacy over it. So I'm curious what you think about this. Is one of them, fetus versus us, is one, or late stage fetus versus us, is one better off, worse off? Is it just a different kind of thing? And obviously that spills over into animals as well.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and it isn't one that I feel like I can satisfactorily answer. I can't get any satisfaction myself out of trying to answer this question. But to address what it is you're saying, I get the point. So for an animal that has less control of its conscious activity, let's put it that way, then their conscious experience, whatever it is, will fill with whatever is there. So they'll be full of pain once they're injured. And there's not the same sort of movement in and out of different states. Their world will just be filled with pain. So then in that sense, it seems like it would be worse. On the other hand, I'm not quite sure they're able to suffer in quite the same way, because in order to suffer, there has to be a comparison with a state of affairs that could be otherwise. And that also seems to be absent. They don't have that reflective ability to time travel and to consider different scenarios. So a lot of it boils down to what it is you're prepared to say the animal can and cannot do with its mental life. And so one of the things that I would throw back at you about the insects is that it's a really neat idea that they have these different homeostatic states that they need to potentially pay attention to. But at the same time, there's an absence of evidence, I think, that insects are truly living a conscious, explicit life. Because if they were, I feel like they would organize themselves better. They might try to communicate with us and tell us to stop nicking their honey, for example. But there's not evidence that they do that kind of thing. So that, to me, suggests that their mental existence is profoundly different. Using moral terms is difficult, but it's definitely not what our mental life is.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because sorry, if you don't mind me jumping in on this now.
That's fine.
Just briefly, I mean, what's tricky about a lot of these things is dissociating being conscious from being smart, right? So, bees are quite clever given that they've only got about 1 million neurons, but there's going to be a limit to how much they're conscious of. And actually, this is even the case that I got interested in this even in the case of pain, because I suspect, what the kinds of pain they feel. It's not, we can feel like a 7 out of 10 burning sensation in our knee. And I suspect you're not going to get that level of specificity. You're not going to get a specific hankering for like hamburgers or lychees or something. You're just going to get like hunger, and then the rest takes over. So some of this is complicated both by the form of life that they have, but also just by the like limited cognitive resources. So they're certainly not going to be self-reflexive. They're certainly not going to think like, gee, it's a fine day out here on the clover field. But whether they have something more like what you were calling very much the sort of surface or the surface level conscious phenomenon, I think that's the kind of thing that's at issue.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't disagree with that. Yeah, I just don't know how to answer it.
Before going to the next question, Ariel, I just want to get the clarification from both of you. So both of you kind of touched upon or mentioned this concept about explicit consciousness or representation or things like that. And I recently have been realizing that many people tend to use these terms with a slightly different kind of ideas, especially if you're talking to different coming from different fields. And for example, the cognitive scientists or robotics people, especially with some background in the logic and so on, they tend to think about this representation or explicitness as almost synonymous as a presence or absence of the symbols. And in this case of the pain, especially, I think potentially it can be related to, in Colin's kind of framework, it may be related to the sort of a plan of the series of actions, like, as a potential kind of representation of pain. But what do you mean exactly by the sort of explicit, consciousness of the pain or, representation of pain and things like that? Is it very different from just feeling the pain itself?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, it's that second order recognition. So knowing that my knee is hurting. So my knee is a little bit painful, right? And for most of this talk, I haven't reflected on it. But I don't think that means it wasn't hurting when I wasn't reflecting on it. It was there, but it just was. Now that I've drawn my attention to it, I'm aware that it's there. And I can keep going. I can draw attention to the fact that I'm drawing attention to the fact that my knee is hurting and become aware of my thoughts about it. So you can see how we can have different levels of introspection and recognition. The ground floor just is, and in a way, it's very hard to talk about it, because as soon as you put it into words, as soon as you verbalize it, you are instantaneously reflecting on it and turning it into that knowing that. I don't think many animals are capable of knowing that. That seems to me quite uniquely human, and comes about not just through neurology but through development.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've always thought of it as higher order as well. And in some of these, you can you can imagine different kinds of. So, for example, as Stuart was talking about, you can imagine different kinds of intervention. Like I could take a Nurofen, and then maybe my back would stop hurting, or I could distract myself, in which case maybe it would be hurting, but I'm no longer have that second order awareness of it, and I can go on and do other things. So yeah, I mean, I think that ability to both to just have the second order states. There's also a great book I love called The Sting of the Wild, by this guy who got stung by basically all the stinging insects there are and described them very carefully. So I think one thing humans can do is really like lavish descriptions of these awful insects. One thing humans can do is not just reflect that they're in pain, but on the qualities of their pain. You get interesting anthropological stuff about this. One of my own colleagues had work on Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighters about how they communicate pain as part of the learning process. So I think you get, all kinds of things. And I agree that a lot of these are, humans are probably the only ones around who can do it, because it takes development, and a lot of this probably requires a certain level of linguistic competence as well.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. Let's go. Ariel?
Yeah, thanks. Stuart, I'm interested in how committed you are to the 12-week fetal development of free nerve endings as the point at which a fetus or a creature would start feeling pain, even if it's not higher order or self-reflective in any way, just because there's a lot of different kinds of nociception that both like humans and other creatures can have. It's like it's easy for me to imagine other kinds of nociception maybe being pain or maybe not being pain. So I'm just wondering how committed you are to that line.
I mean, I suppose I've done most work with the fetus, and then the most thinking, let's put it that way. And the reason, and in some ways that's easier than thinking about animals, because it is human. So we know, where it's going and what it's developing, and we know a lot about the neurobiology of humans. So I certainly wouldn't map what's happening in the fetus in any kind of direct way into what happens with other creatures. I think your point is a reasonable one, that other creatures will have other mechanisms of feeling and sensing, which will matter. As to the broader question of how committed am I at the 12 weeks, not very. I think 12 weeks is a bit early. Most of the nociceptors still haven't fully developed and haven't penetrated most of the tissue. And I do think nociceptors are a reasonable requirement for pain from injury. And that's really what we're talking about with the fetus. We're not talking about the fetus getting a headache or something like that. Spontaneous pain is not of interest. It's pain in response to surgery that's of most concern. And so, 12 weeks is a bit early, but by 18 weeks, there's clearly a connection from the periphery into the brainstem. There's a cortisol stress response that you can measure, and there's fetal movement that's very clear. So at that point, you've got an organized nervous system responding to noxious insults in a way that's recognizable as at least a reflexive defensive reaction, if not some form of recognition that hurts.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. I guess my motivation is I find it a bit amusing to define pain in functionalist terms, and then pick what seems to me to be a little bit of an arbitrary line somewhere, when I can also look at like how plants have nociception, or even a bacteria arguably can have nociception. So I'm always curious about where people draw the line. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I get it. It is a curious process of trying to say yes, no to these different things. Yeah.
We have one YouTube question, and I also have another question from Yaron, but I also had one question, so let me ask one first. Obviously, pain is multidimensional, or composed of many different components. Like according to Colin, it's intensity and location, and also quality, and so on, right? And also second order, higher order kind of thoughts, or implied actions and things like that. So I remember, Colin, that now we have actually maybe Olivia has already left, but she's still here. We talked a little bit about kind of measurement of the similarity of pain when we met, first in Olivia's place, several years ago. Would you think it's plausible to characterize many various different kinds of pain, not by verbal naming or rating of each in isolation, but in comparison with each other of the pain over either, simultaneously on, let's say, this side and this side, or over the time, to characterize what the pain is with minimum kind of theoretical framework imposed on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be super interested in that. I'm not sure if there's been any work done on it. So Sabrina Connick's, who's I believe still at Bochum, and finished up a dissertation. She's very interested in the idea of whether you can make similarity spaces for pain, and also whether you can. She's really interested in these cases where it's hard to distinguish, for example, between pains and itches or pains and other kinds of sensations. Right. So I think there are two questions. One is whether you could get a kind of atheoretical similarity space for pain, and another is whether there's a distinct similarity space for pain that's kind of incommensurate with the similarity space for other bodily sensations, which is certainly something that my theory would predict, and basically everyone would predict. So she is part of there's a kind of eliminativism about pain. Jennifer Corns at Glasgow also has a book about this, trying to argue that there's no sort of well-founded notion. I mean, I think that's false, and I also have to think it's false, but Sabrina's stuff is very good. So her stuff is worth checking out because she's explicitly interested in like the kinds of similarity spaces you might find. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting avenue of research on this.
That's great.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. I mean, Colin mentioned that pain is not very informative, and there is some truth in that. Even though when you're in pain, you exquisitely know what it feels like. Trying to explain it and describe it is quite tricky for most people. And then if you try and recall, a pain experience, that you can't seem to conjure up the exact nature of what the experience was. So making comparisons across different pains, across time and space is not very straightforward. And then connected to that was this issue about whether or not pain is a bundle of different things, you know, sensation, affect, cognition. And I tend to think that it is, but I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that there is a potentially a core essence to pain, and that it has some sort of inherent unity, and it is what it is. You know, I'm drawn to that idea that there's the bundle thing is a little bit problematic, because you can always pull something out, right? Do we really need to know where it is? Do we really need to know that it's throbbing? Does it really need to be unpleasant, and so on? So it feels like hidden behind that there might be some essence.
Okay, all right, thank you. Maybe Colin, I wanted to get that reference later, and that would be great. And maybe we'll go to Yaron. Do you want to speak? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that my camera is a little bit problematic, so I cannot show myself. So I have a question to Stuart. First of all, thank you very much for your really interesting talk. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about degeneracy, in the sense that different system can take over the function of other system. I'm referring to your to what you said about this study that shows that you can have pain without the certain peptide or without a certain part of the frontal cortex. So how should we think about this in the context of whether there is some kind of subsystem that take over?
Yeah, so you raise a difficulty with all lesion studies and all studies of people that are born without particular brain parts, that there's always the possibility that different brain area will subsume the function of the parts that are missing. So, I mean, we know this from people who do lose limbs, that the parts of the somatosensory cortex that are no longer being used by that limb, they don't just go quiet, they don't die. The surrounding areas of somatosensory cortex invade and take over the neural function. So that plasticity is a real thing. It can definitely happen. I think in the two studies that I mentioned, the reason why I find them compelling is because there's zero experience of pain in the people born congenitally insensitive to pain. Again, I can't remember. It's the TRPV1 gene that they're missing, and they just their nociceptors just don't work, and they don't feel any pain from noxious insults. And one of the people in that study would, as a kid, as a trick, would set his hand on fire with a cigarette lighter just to scare all the other kids, and it didn't hurt. Caused him a lot of damage, but it didn't hurt. So there's no question that there's the function's been taken over by something else. It just hasn't. In the brain study, the person in that study, I can't remember how the brain damage came about, but it was extensive. I mean, it's impressively extensive. So the areas of the brain that we associate with pain are largely knocked out. And given that they're all knocked out, it would take quite a remarkable amount of plasticity to recover all that function. But that's definitely possible. And there are still vestiges of cortex in that patient as well, which arguably performing the function that the full cortex performs in someone intact.
Fine, Yaron.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
All right, and then before going to Ariel's further question, one comment from question from YouTube. How does knowing that we are in pain relate to being in pain? If pain is a homeostatic sensation like hunger, and not an indicative sensation like vision.
Do you want to take that, Colin?
Sorry, I missed the second part of that. So what was the distinction supposed to be?
First is knowing that we are in pain relate to being pain.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, I'm not sure if this is just the same sort of answer that Stuart and I gave before. So again, knowing that, I suppose I tend to think of knowing that anything as a cognitively slightly more demanding proposition, or I naturally read that as the kind of reflexive consciousness or explicit consciousness that we were talking about before. So it needs some ability to reflect on the state that you're actually in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an interesting issue that the questioner brings up, which is, well, how does knowing that inform the lower level being that? And I think It does, and I think the vision experiment illustrates one way in which, you know, conceptual understanding can influence what we see. So I see a bookshelf with a load of messy books behind me. I don't see, you know, just an association, a list of lines, or I don't see a lump. You know, I see separate book objects, and that's, I think, connected to the fact that I've grown up and come to understand how objects separate themselves and how they integrate themselves. If you grow up without that, then you might have the same basic being that, but when it's informed by your knowing that, what you see is different.
But
I think one of the oh, sorry. Okay.
just quick clarification discussion is that I always find that that kind of argument through the development or evolution is a bit weak for pain, particularly because we can actually experience pain that we have never experienced before, relatively often throughout the life, right? Like the kind of the pain that you experience for the first time about with I have never had that before, but this bladder stone or something like that, or breaking the bone in somewhere, or cutting it in some way, or getting a very hot thing or very cold thing you have never experienced through your development. Still you feel in it that way. So
I wonder about this some though. Like, so I because I've thought about this a lot. I have a son who's now 6.5, and it's interesting the way kids relate to pain. There's certainly this phenomenon where they look at you get injured and they look at you to see. And you can do a lot of shaping of saying that doesn't hurt, keep going. I remember when my son got a bit too heavy to ride on my shoulders for long periods, and he would complain that his feet were sparkly. And after a while, I had to say, "Oh, that's your foot has fallen asleep. That's a kind of pain." And then is there? So I wonder the degree to which, I mean, in the same way that, for example, and I'm never quite sure how this fits with my theory, but that kids, in some sense, have to learn that the sensation that they're feeling is that they need to go to the bathroom. So I actually think a lot of the, childhood development stuff, it's very I mean, it's always a kind of a mystery what kids are feeling, especially in the 2 to 3 year old age. But I do feel like there's at least some room for perceptual learning. There can't be heaps because I think, as you said, evolutionarily, there are good reasons for a lot of this stuff to be up and running quickly in some form. But I'm particularly interested in the bladder control end of things and what's going on when a kid learns how to interpret those sensations.
Yeah, and in many ways, this is the issue I'm trying to grapple with. So I can buy that there is some sort of just feel pain, and that's what it is. But as you grow older and develop and become more mentally sophisticated, I think we leave a lot of that behind, because now you feel through your psychology. I mean, we always feel through our psychology. And as your psychology becomes more sophisticated, then presumably what we feel will change. And there's no return to that innocent state of just being that we had in our infancy.
Okay, Ariel?
Yeah. This is a slightly less well-formed question than my previous ones, and I think it's primarily directed towards Colin, but I'd be interested to hear anyone's take. I've not experienced it myself, but I can imagine the style of having pain after having morphine or some sort of other brain lesion, and feeling pain or nociception in some sense, but it's qualitatively quite different from normal pain. What I'm just really unsure about is the idea of feeling a sensation like itchiness without the urge to itch. And I guess I'm just curious as to whether it even makes sense to speculate about having the sensation of itchiness without feeling the urge to itch. And I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it gets quite complicated. So I think insofar as you get dissociation, so a lot of what I have to say is that, in most cases, what you don't get, or when you get the dissociation of pain and motion, or protection, you only get that because you have a fairly profound disruption to your kind of sense of self in the first place. So maybe like the kinds of syndromes I've written about a bit in connection with this are like depersonalization syndromes. So I have no idea whether anyone has written about depersonalization and itch. That's fairly, I mean, itch itself is a fairly niche topic, but I suppose I do think that for most of these, you're not going to get, so I think it's relatively easy to get, say, pain or hunger or itch without unpleasantness or some kind of felt unpleasantness. But what's very hard is to get it without kind of the felt motivational urge. And there are debates around this in the literature, but I think, I suppose what I'm generally committed to is like you can't get that without some fairly heavy duty dissociation. I don't know, Stuart. Do you know much about itch? Like, I've hit it occasionally, and then I have a friend who has this kind of one of these bad autoimmune conditions where she has to scratch all the time, and is itching all the time. It sounds dreadful when it happens, but I'm not sure it doesn't get the kind of research attention that pain does, as far as I know.
No, it doesn't. And a lot of surgeons tell me that it's a much bigger problem than pain because, post-surgical itch is a nightmare. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. All right. Is there any further question? Otherwise, I had kind of another question. You haven't actually talked about phantom pain, right? Or kind of you touched upon both a little bit, but related to this learning and so on. I'm curious whether people who are born without the limbs also sometimes experience pain in the location where they don't have a limb, because it's also speaks to some kind of the core of the pain stuff that Stuart talks about, and also learning aspect of the pain that Colin talks about. If they experience pain, then to me that is quite a strong evidence to think about. There is something in the neuronal connection in the probably somatosensory cortex plus motor cortex plus amygdala or something. When that figures in some particular way, then that automatically generates this experience of the pain in itself. And that can happen with or without actual limb to move or actual experience of some kind. It's more sort of a structural or informational kind of idea about the pain itself. What do you think?
Yeah, well, Ariel's just put a research report in the chat. So my recollection was that it's much less common if you're born without a limb to both have a phantom limb and to feel pain in it. It's less. Many still get a phantom limb, but then much fewer feel pain, and that's I think what Ariel's just posted 20%. So it whereas in people who have a traumatic limb loss, it gets up to 70 to 90% feel pain. So there's a big difference, but it's not zero. So that is interesting. I take your point.
Yeah, what I'd be curious, that was also my impression. I was just thinking about it, and again, thinking about what Stuart was talking about. I mean, one interesting thing would also be the quality of it. So whether you're getting, whether it's more like one of these sort of non-specific pain syndromes. So, you do get, I'm thinking of other things like, I can never remember what the new name for thalamic pain syndrome is, but you get certain kinds of pain syndromes where people just describe it's like a bad pain, but just sort of over everywhere in a part of your body. And I'm quite curious whether the phantom limb pain is more like, it's just like the pain in their other leg, but in that leg, or whether it's, oh, look, like it's there and it hurts, and that's kind of as much as you can say. Because that would suggest some evidence for like, feedback and perceptual learning being important for the quality of the pain. But it's an interesting question. I don't know, like, yeah.
Yeah, you piqued my interest. I've read that literature for a long time.
Yeah, me neither.
And but even if we don't have maybe it's not a really high rate of this congenital people, but I still think that pain is also referred to the location around the body, right? Probably usually. even if you have some kind of accident or damage or epilepsy and things like that, has there been ever report of the pain in a distant location outside of body, like this one feels painful or something, logically, I think it's plausible to think about it, but I've never heard of it, and whether this, I wonder whether this is a kind of one of the core essence of the pain. It has to be experienced together with other sensation. Again, this is sort of idea of the structure or informational kind of idea about the pain.
I've got a student on his committee. He's a Lawrence Kesser at UT Austin, who's written some about this, and I think he's sent some of the stuff out. They're definitely, so it's very hard to find cases. I think one of the interesting questions is whether you can find cases where it not just simply then felt as incorporated into the body. So you might think, look, under the right circumstances, say if I had a prosthetic arm and someone hit it, maybe you can imagine feeling pain in that, which is not strictly speaking part of the organic body, but it would still be part of the kind of felt body. It's very hard to find clear cases otherwise. There's some reports from, most of the time when people talk about this, they talk about reports from patients with delusions, so like somatoparaphrenia, where there'll be people who think that their limb is not theirs and also this other person's limb is, and they say that when they get pricked, they're feeling it in their cousin's limb. But because those are delusional states and because you're going more from the report than anything, it's unclear that that's particularly strong evidence. So yeah, I mean, Wittgenstein has a little bit about it that everyone quotes about whether there could be pain patches on the wall or something. Yeah, but otherwise, no. I mean, it's actually interesting. I was talking with Lawrence about this, that it's just, if it's possible, you don't seem to see many reports that would suggest it, and the stuff that people refer to is all pretty weak. So it does seem like there's some link between having pain and having at least what you perceive of as the boundaries of your body. I mean, there's a view which starts sounding very kind of goth, although Stuart did bring up Nietzsche. That's like what's part of your body and what's not by where you can feel pain. So you can invert this. You can say, look, part of how we get a sense of bodily boundaries is where we feel pain. So then it becomes impossible, partly because feeling pain is partly constitutive of the bodily boundaries itself. But yeah, it's interesting. I've not seen, unlike most other claims that things go necessarily together in philosophy, where then you can easily find clinical cases where they come apart. This is one where there doesn't seem to be much going on that's very clear.
That's super
I don't know if
interesting.
you come across anything, Stuart?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think the only thing I would add is that I do think embodiment matters. I mean, it matters for, I think, all our senses. That you need material to feel. You've got to have something to feel and connect to the world through. But for pain, yeah, it just seems it's bodily. That's it, and it's key to it.
But one thing that you said, Colin, that really intrigued me. So it's Nietzsche who said that the boundary of the body can be defined by where we can feel, right?
No, I just said Stuart mentioned Nietzsche,
okay.
And so
Stuart.
that felt kind of dark, and so
yeah, but
so,
that's
no, that wasn't Nietzsche.
Okay.
Nietzsche says other stuff about pain, but
all right.
Yeah.
Then that was my misunderstanding. But anyway, that statement was very curious to me, because is there any part of the body which cannot feel pain?
Your insides. Yeah.
I don't know. Hair?
If it gets tricky, your internal visceral organs, they're fairly insensitive. Stretch, they'll feel, but it's hard to get an experience of pain out of a lot of them. For part of my career, I put balloons into sigmoid colons and inflated them. And people
Wait, I didn't realize you did anal balloon experiments. That's great.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I always bring up to students is like in the name of science.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was a really curious period of my life, but it didn't. Often the patient would say, "Yeah, it's uncomfortable. I definitely don't like it, but I wouldn't quite say it's painful." So yeah, if you want to, the internal organs potentially.
Yeah, Ariel, you said that the brain can't feel pain. That I totally agree with that. But what I'm talking is not like that. It's more to do with that we cannot feel the pain, the location of the, physical location where the brain sits. And I think that's probably possible anywhere in this, head location. If you have a 3D coordinate, and then if I try to locate where the pain is coming from, it's not necessarily kind of restricted to where the muscle is or something, right? That's what I mean more.
I think I get migraines localized where my brain is, though. I mean, bit tricky to tell. It's more like just the whole volume.
But my interest is more to do with, inside of this boundary, I can feel pain, but I cannot feel pain somewhere here, for example.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were some comments on YouTube that also misunderstood my comment. But anyway, all right. Is there any other comment or question? If not, then I have one relatively simple thing as well. So it's kind of related to the inverted qualia type argument. But in the case of the pain, has there been some kind of, idea or animal experiment or whatever, or maybe humans, where something that usually results in the pain experience or pain related behavior is kind of shifted or connected into something else, like itch or whatever. And then isn't it actually relatively easy to imagine that can happen, at least rewiring the neurons according to Stuart's kind of framework. If it's the cortex that is generating this pain and the input kind of pattern, if it's modulated in some way, then something that should usually generate the itchiness now generate pain, or pain generate itchiness, and then that result in a very non-adaptive behavior or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know of any experiments that have like transformed sensory perception in that kind of way. That's quite radical. But everybody's familiar with Pavlov and his salivating dogs. And then we know that he used a bell, although he didn't actually use a bell. But never mind. He also did use noxious stimuli. He would burn the dogs before he fed them, and gradually they would start wagging and salivating and being seemingly happy when they were getting burnt before they were being fed. So you can certainly modify the behavioral profile in animals. I don't think anything. Well, no, I don't think anything like that's been really tried in humans. It'd be hard to do for obvious reasons.
Yeah, but that's probably
I've seen it done with rats as this is like a bad 60s because I read some stuff on masochism, and there's like a kind of folk theory of masochism that people are wired up wrong, and so like they like being whipped or something. But so I've seen do a similar thing with rats. I mean, the problem is that the folk theory is clearly wrong, because if you ask people who say they like being whipped, they also say it hurts. So it's not just like stuff is wired up differently. Other than that, that's actually a really interesting question. Yeah.
Because many of this, idea that you said, especially Colin, is that as long as it can motivate things, the quality of the pain can be substituted in something else, right? Actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I always kind of hope we can't generate inverted spectrum arguments for things, because then I'd probably have to be a different kind of physicalist at least. it is interesting to think about. I mean, of course, Lewis has the mad pain and Martian pain kinds of thought experiments, but I've never found those particularly grabby. Yeah, that's interesting though.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
then I succeeded to let you think about something potentially annoying. Yeah. Okay. We have another question, Phil, and maybe we are reaching to 1 hour and a half. So maybe this would be the last question, unless anybody else has a pressing question. Phil.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering how useful you think it would be to teach, say, kids during their early years in terms of more mindfulness, to reduce that like metacognitive aspect of overthinking your pain and getting them to a point of just perceiving pain as is, whether that would be a useful thing.
I mean, probably it's interesting. I suppose there's what one really needs is there are probably ethical issues here, and I feel like one sort of wants an expert on like kind of ethics of childhood and autonomy or something about this. But I do think that actually probably parents do a lot of this, at least kind of informally. So certainly with spend a lot of time saying, no, you're not really hungry, like pay attention, you just ate, think about how hungry you really are, it's going to be fine, we're going to eat in an hour. Like I think that kind of like teaching kids metacognitive strategies is something that's kind of done ad hoc for a long time. And so it may be, I think the Australian schools do a bit of this now, from what I can tell. I get kind of garbled reports, but trying to get kids to think a little bit more about like, step back and think about their emotions. And so I imagine for some of this as well. I mean, I guess one thing that's I always kind of say with some of this, I think mindfulness is really interesting and really important. But it's also important for kids just to be able to express freely when they are in pain. Like a lot of these strategies, it's kind of double-edged, because you don't want your kid to whinge too much about being hungry, but you also don't want them to feel like they can't express when they're actually really hungry. And so there's a kind of awesome responsibility of shaping that appropriately. But I suspect for some of this, like you've already get some ad hoc version of it, and there's probably some slightly more systematic way to do it.
Yep, interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'd agree with that, and I'm also a little bit skeptical of professionalizing parenting too much and allowing experts to come in and start saying, well, you need to do this, you need to do that. Parents usually do a pretty good job of figuring out their kid and what it is that's in its best interests. So yeah, I would concur with Colin's caution on that. But yeah, I wouldn't say that it's impossible we couldn't give little bits of advice that might be useful.
Yep, awesome. Thank you for that.
All right. With that, then maybe we'll stop YouTube streaming at this point, and then we'll close the session. Bye, YouTube, for now. All right.